They say silence has a language of its own, one that doesn't need words to speak truth. When two souls stop chasing, when an avoidant finally meets someone's absence instead of their persistence, something shifts. The silence they once used to feel powerful starts to echo, and in that echo the game, the energy, the control, the illusion, flips. The power of absence is one of the most underestimated forces in human connection. When two people are emotionally intertwined, especially when one of them has avoidant tendencies, distance becomes more than just physical separation. It becomes a silent dialogue, an invisible current where everything unsaid begins to speak louder than any conversation ever could. For the avoidant, space is safety. It's the one place where they feel in control of their emotions, where they can escape the intensity of connection that feels threatening to their inner equilibrium. But when you decide to match their silence with your own, the very thing that once protected them starts to turn against them. Avoidants often believe they hold the upper hand by withdrawing. It's not always out of cruelty or manipulation. It's often rooted in fear. Fear of dependency, fear of rejection, fear of losing their individuality inside emotional closeness. They pull away because they need to breathe, to regain the sense of autonomy they feel slipping away when someone gets too close. They expect that you'll chase, that you'll fill the silence with reassurance, that your longing will restore their control over the emotional dynamic. It's not arrogance. It's the psychology of survival for someone who learned early on that love and safety rarely coexist. But something profound happens when you stop chasing, when your energy no longer reaches for them. The game flips, not because you're trying to play one, but because the structure that held your connection together begins to shift. Avoidants are comfortable in the familiar rhythm of pursuit and withdrawal. They push, you pull, they distance, you reach. It's predictable, safe, and it reinforces their subconscious belief that they are always the one in control. Yet, when your silence meets theirs, when you stop feeding that dynamic, the comfort of their emotional distance transforms into an unexpected discomfort. The silence that once gave them peace now becomes a mirror, reflecting back their own emotional avoidance. Absence changes the landscape. It exposes what was hidden beneath the noise of pursuit and withdrawal. For the first time, the avoidant has to confront what they've been running from, the reality that your presence was never the threat they believed it to be, and your absence is not as freeing as they imagined. In the quiet, memories echo. Emotions they thought they could suppress resurface. The void they once needed becomes too loud to ignore. Because absence is not just about you not being there, it's about them realizing what your presence meant. At a deeper psychological level, absence forces both people to sit with their truth. For the one who used to chase, it's a confrontation with their own fear of abandonment, their need to be needed, their habit of earning love through persistence. For the avoidant, it's a confrontation with the loneliness they've disguised as independence. When you both stop reaching, the balance of emotional energy resets. What was once an imbalance, where one gave too much and the other withdrew too far, begins to equalize. In this silence, something powerful unfolds. The avoidant begins to feel the weight of what was once taken for granted. They might not say it, they might not even understand it fully, but they start to sense that the emotional control they once had came from your willingness to be there. Without your effort, their distance loses its meaning. The power of absence lies in this reversal. It turns what was once a shield into a mirror. What they thought would protect them now reveals them. And what you thought was loss becomes your liberation. Absence, when rooted in self-respect rather than punishment, becomes a quiet revolution. It doesn't seek to manipulate, only to restore balance. It teaches both souls something essential, that love cannot be sustained by one person's effort or by one person's fear. In the end, silence does what words cannot. It exposes truth, redefines power, and awakens the kind of awareness that only comes when both people are finally still. The reversal of energy begins the moment you stop reaching for someone who has been pulling away. In relationships with avoidant individuals, the emotional current often flows in one direction. You give, they withdraw. You seek closeness, they seek distance. This dynamic isn't random. It's a pattern built on deep-seated fears and learned survival instincts. The avoidant thrives in emotional safety, and as long as you are the one bridging the gap, they can maintain their illusion of control. But once you stop extending your energy toward them, once you pull back your emotional investment, something begins to shift beneath the surface. The power dynamic that defined your connection quietly begins to reverse. At first, they may not notice. Avoidants are accustomed to the chase, to feeling desired and pursued. It validates their worth without demanding their vulnerability. They rely on your emotional presence to affirm that they are still wanted, even while they keep you at a distance. It's a paradox. Wanting love, but fearing its depth. Craving connection, but running from its demands. When you stop feeding that paradox, when you stop giving them the emotional reassurance they didn't know they depended on, the energy between you begins to balance itself. They can no longer define the relationship by your effort because the motion that kept it alive has ceased. This reversal doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, in the spaces between messages that are never sent, in the pauses where they used to expect your response. They start to feel something unfamiliar, not necessarily regret at first, but a subtle disorientation. The silence, once comforting, starts to feel heavier. Their subconscious begins to sense that the dynamic has changed. You are no longer orbiting around their emotional rhythm. The attention they once took for granted fades, and what replaces it is an uneasy awareness of absence. Energy in relationships is not just emotional, it's psychological and spiritual. When you were chasing, your energy was outward, your thoughts, emotions, and actions all focused on them. The moment you stop, that energy turns inward. You start to reclaim the parts of yourself that were given away. You stop performing emotional labor for someone who never asked for it, but who also relied on it to maintain their comfort. The reversal of energy is not about punishment. It's about equilibrium. You are no longer leaking your energy into a space that doesn't return it. You begin to stabilize, and in that stillness, you become grounded. For the avoidant, this shift feels strange because it challenges their internal narrative. They are used to believing that intimacy is something they can control by keeping distance, that they are the ones who decide when connection deepens or dies. But now, that power slips through their fingers. They no longer have the emotional upper hand because you've stopped feeding the dynamic. In your silence, they lose the mirror that once reflected their emotional safety. The validation they received from your pursuit is gone, and what remains is their own unresolved emptiness. The reversal also exposes what was hidden beneath their avoidance, fear disguised as detachment. When the energy stops flowing toward them, the void within becomes more visible. They might try to distract themselves, to rationalize your silence, to convince themselves that they prefer it this way, but the human psyche has a way of bringing buried truths to the surface. The emotional current that once flowed toward them now flows back into you, and energetically they feel that withdrawal. It's not just your absence they sense, it's the loss of emotional nourishment that once stabilized their defenses. On your side, the reversal feels liberating. The anxiety that once came from waiting for their response begins to fade. You start to notice the return of your own emotional power, your clarity, your peace. The dynamic no longer drains you because you've taken your energy back. And ironically, that's when they start to feel the pull. not because they've suddenly become secure, but because they can feel the shift in the unseen balance between you. What was once their comfort zone becomes their discomfort, and what was once your pain becomes your peace. This is the quiet flip of the game, not through force but through the natural laws of emotional energy finding its way back home. The awakening of the subconscious begins in the silence that follows disconnection. When you and the avoidant stop reaching for each other, something profound begins to stir beneath the surface. On the outside, it looks like nothing. No messages, no calls, no contact. But inside, a psychological storm brews quietly. Avoidants spend much of their emotional life keeping their subconscious under control. They bury fear beneath logic, vulnerability beneath detachment, and desire beneath independence. Their mind learns to suppress what their heart cannot process. Yet, when the contact breaks, when the constant reassurance and noise of connection fade away, the subconscious no longer has anywhere to hide. The silence becomes a trigger. It opens the door they've spent years trying to keep shut. Avoidants are not unaffected by separation. They are simply skilled at avoiding the confrontation that separation brings. As long as you were present, messaging, explaining, forgiving, reaching out, they could remain emotionally dormant. They didn't have to feel the weight of their avoidance because your presence absorbed it for them. Your energy filled the emotional void they refused to acknowledge. But when you step back, the emotional noise that once drowned out their deeper fears disappears, and what remains is an echo that grows louder each day. That echo is their own subconscious calling them to face what they've long suppressed. The fear of abandonment, the pain of rejection, the grief of emotional disconnection that began long before you entered their life. At first, they might intellectualize it. They tell themselves it's for the best, that space is what they needed, that you were too much or the relationship too complicated. This is the conscious mind trying to regain control. But the subconscious is relentless. It doesn't respond to logic, it responds to feeling. Slowly, memories start to surface, your tone of voice, your laughter, the comfort of your presence. These fragments become emotional symbols, stirring parts of them that were long asleep. They might not recognize it as longing. It often feels more like restlessness or anxiety. But underneath, the subconscious is awakening to the emotional reality they've denied, the truth that detachment doesn't protect them, it isolates them. The awakening isn't peaceful, it's confusing, even painful. The avoidant begins to experience cognitive dissonance. Part of them wants to stay in control, to remain distant, while another part begins to ache for the very intimacy they once resisted. They start to question their own patterns, sometimes unconsciously. Why does the silence feel heavier than expected? Why do they think of you at random times? Why does independence suddenly feel like emptiness? These are not conscious questions at first. They arise as sensations, moods, or dreams. The subconscious has a language of its own, and once awakened, it communicates through emotion rather than words. The absence of your energy amplifies this awakening. Without your emotional presence to stabilize them, the avoidant is left to sit with their own inner chaos. What they use to project onto you, their discomfort, their fear, their defensiveness, now returns to its source. They can no longer escape themselves. This is the point where growth becomes possible, though it rarely feels like it. The subconscious, once awake, forces confrontation. It demands acknowledgement of old wounds and unmet needs. For some avoidants, this is when regret begins to form, not necessarily for losing you, but for realizing how their avoidance has shaped every meaningful connection they've ever had. For you, this awakening also mirrors back your own subconscious work. You too start to see the patterns that kept you chasing love that resisted you. You begin to understand why you felt drawn to someone emotionally unavailable, and what that says about your own fear of being unseen. The silence becomes a mutual initiation, a mirror through which both of you face the parts of yourselves that thrive on emotional imbalance. The awakening of the subconscious doesn't always lead to reconciliation, but it always leads to realization. It transforms emotional avoidance into self-awareness. What once felt like rejection starts to look like reflection. In the end, the silence between you isn't empty, it's full of meaning, full of truth. It's the space where buried emotions rise to the surface, and the hidden self finally begins to speak. When you and the avoidant stop contacting each other, a deeper process unfolds beneath the surface, one that involves facing the emotional mirror neither of you could confront when the connection was active. The silence between you becomes more than just the absence of words. It becomes a reflection, showing both of you the shadows that drove your behavior. The avoidant, who once relied on distance to feel safe, begins to encounter the emptiness that lives behind that safety. You, who once reached to close the gap, start to meet the part of yourself that equated love with effort and pain. This is where the emotional mirror begins its work, where both of you start to see the hidden sides of yourselves that the relationship quietly exposed. For the avoidant, love often triggers a confrontation with their deepest fear, vulnerability. They've spent much of their life protecting themselves from emotional exposure. The closer someone gets, the more unsafe they feel, because intimacy threatens to uncover their unhealed wounds. Avoidants are not cold. They are wounded souls who learned that connection brings loss, criticism, or disappointment. So, when they pull away, it isn't rejection in the purest sense. It's self-preservation. But in silence, without the distraction of conflict or reassurance, they are forced to face the reflection of that fear. They begin to see that their avoidance is not freedom. It's a prison. The emotional mirror shows them how their need for control has cost them the very connection they secretly longed for. At the same time, you face your own reflection. When the avoidant withdraws, your instinct may have been to chase, to fix, to prove that love can heal the distance. This comes from your own shadow, the part of you that believes love must be earned, that closeness depends on effort. When you finally stop reaching, you meet the discomfort of your own silence. The need for validation that once fueled your pursuit surfaces in raw form. You begin to see how your love was often an attempt to soothe your own fear of being unwanted. The mirror shows you the parts of yourself that confuse giving with deserving, loyalty with self-abandonment. In this mirrored silence, both of you begin to awaken to truth. The avoidant sees how their emotional walls have kept them from the warmth they crave, while you realize that love cannot be sustained by chasing what runs from you. The relationship becomes a symbolic mirror, each person's pain reflected in the other's actions. Their distance reflected your fear of loss. Your pursuit reflected their fear of engulfment. You were two people trying to heal opposite wounds through each other, not realizing that you were recreating them instead. The emotional mirror also reveals how love and fear coexist within both of you. The avoidant's fear of being consumed mirrors your fear of being forgotten. Both fears are rooted in the same shadow, the loss of self in the presence or absence of love. When contact stops, this shared wound is exposed. The silence acts as a container for healing, though it doesn't feel like healing at first. It feels like grief, confusion, and emptiness. Yet, in that stillness, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You cannot escape yourself through another, and they cannot find safety by running from what they feel. This stage is often the most transformative because it dismantles illusion. The avoidant begins to realize that their need for solitude was never about peace. It was about avoiding the pain of connection. You begin to understand that your love was never just affection. It was an unconscious attempt to fill an emotional void. The mirror forces both of you to take ownership of your emotional patterns. You start to recognize how your need to fix them was really a reflection of your own need to be healed. They start to understand how pushing you away was a way of avoiding their own fear of inadequacy. The silence becomes the teacher. It teaches the avoidant that isolation does not equal control, and it teaches you that surrender does not mean loss. In the mirror of no contact, each of you sees yourself more clearly than ever before. It is not a comfortable reflection, but it is an honest one. The shadows you both carried are no longer hidden behind communication or conflict. They stand in plain sight, and though it may feel like distance has broken the bond, what it has really done is strip away illusion, leaving only truth. Two people standing on opposite sides of a mirror, finally seeing what they had been running from all along. When contact between you and an avoidant stops, it feels like everything has ended, like the story has closed without resolution. But beneath that silence, a quiet transformation begins, one that neither of you expected. What looks like disconnection on the surface is, in truth, a turning point. The withdrawal that once felt like rejection becomes the space where both of you begin to evolve. When communication fades, the noise of emotional chasing and retreat disappears, and what remains is raw truth. This truth doesn't arrive gently. It arrives through stillness, through discomfort, through the realization that love cannot survive in its old form. It must transform, and so must both of you. For the avoidant, the loss of contact marks the breakdown of their emotional defense system. They built walls not because they wanted to hurt anyone, but because those walls once kept them safe. Emotional intimacy for them has always been like fire. It draws them in, but it also burns. As long as you were present, reaching out, trying to hold the connection together, they didn't have to confront what lived behind their avoidance. Your pursuit allowed them to remain distant while still feeling desired. But when you stop, truly stop, the walls they built no longer serve a purpose. The silence becomes a vacuum, and in that vacuum they are forced to face themselves. They begin to notice the hollowness that once felt like peace. The solitude they sought now feels colder. Without the emotional current flowing from you, they must finally confront what that current was feeding: loneliness, fear, and unacknowledged longing. This is where transformation begins. Avoidants often believe that detachment equals freedom, but true freedom only comes from awareness. In the silence, awareness starts to awaken. They start to feel the emotional consequences of their patterns. The comfort of emotional control starts to feel more like isolation, and the avoidance that once gave them safety begins to feel like a cage. At the same time, your transformation begins in a different form. When you stop reaching out, it's not just an act of letting go, it's an act of self-return. You begin to redirect all the energy you once poured into understanding them back toward understanding yourself. The pain of missing them becomes the catalyst for rediscovering your strength. You start to see that your love was never the problem, but the way you expressed it, through overgiving, through waiting, through proving, was rooted in your own fear of being unseen. The silence becomes a mirror, showing you where you abandoned yourself in pursuit of someone emotionally unavailable. This process is not easy. It's filled with nights where you question whether they ever cared, moments when you want to break the silence, and thoughts that tempt you to reach back out. But every time you choose stillness instead of chasing, you strengthen your inner foundation. You start to understand that love cannot exist without self-respect. Your worth does not diminish because someone was too afraid to meet it. In that understanding, your emotional energy transforms from dependency into sovereignty. Eventually, the silence begins to change its tone. For the avoidant, what started as comfort becomes discomfort, and for you, what began as pain becomes peace. The dynamic flips. You no longer carry the weight of emotional effort, and they begin to feel the absence of what once came so easily from you. This isn't about revenge or validation. It's about energetic truth. Relationships are an exchange of emotional energy, and when one person withdraws theirs to heal, the other must face their own emptiness. The avoidant may not immediately reach out or express their realization, but internally, something shifts. They start to see that your absence holds meaning. Transformation through withdrawal is not about changing them, it's about changing you. The silence becomes sacred space, space for both souls to evolve separately before they can understand what connection really means. When you stop trying to rescue or chase, you give the avoidant the opportunity to confront their own patterns. Whether they choose to change is beyond your control, but the moment you stop participating in the old dynamic, you have already changed the game. The power returns to balance. What once felt like loss becomes the beginning of alignment. The connection may never return in the same way, but what grows in its place is awareness of self, of boundaries, of truth. This is how endings turn into awakenings, and how distance becomes the silent force that transforms everything. When you and an avoidant stop contacting each other, what feels like an ending is really the beginning of transformation. The silence is not punishment, it's revelation. It reveals what words could never reach, the truth of what both hearts were running from. The avoidant begins to face the emptiness behind their distance, and you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that you lost in trying to love them. The power dynamic that once kept you bound dissolves, and in its place, a quiet awakening takes root. This awakening teaches both of you that love cannot survive in the shadow of fear. It must be born again through awareness, balance, and authenticity. The game only flips when you no longer play it, when you stop chasing, stop proving, and start listening to the silence that heals you. Because in that stillness, the lesson becomes clear. The one who walks away to find themselves is never truly the one who loses.